From Washington, the McLaughlin Group, the American original. For over 3 decades, the sharpest minds, best sources, hardest talk.
Welcome to the McLaughlin Group, a show where friends disagree agreeably. I'm Tom Rogan. This week we'll debate President Trump's coronavirus travel ban on Europe, collapsing oil prices, an Iranian attack on US forces in Iraq, and more. Our panelists today are The Hill's Al Weaver, Eleanor Clift of the Daily Beast, Clarence Page of the Chicago Tribune, and Carrie Sheffield of Just the News. Okay, let's get to issue 1, quarantine.
We will be suspending all travel from Europe to the United States for the next 30 days. The new rules will go into effect Friday at midnight.
Born of the mid-17th century bubonic plague outbreak, quarantine comes from the Italian word quaranta, or 40. It entails a 40-day period of isolation. Borrowing from that principle in action this week, President Trump suspended travel from 26 European nations for 30 days. The President and Congress also moved to enact a multi-billion-dollar bill to provide coronavirus-related support to businesses. The urgency reflects a global concern. Even as China moves to recover, the virus is spreading across the world.
Al, how do you rate the President's speech and how is it being received, do you think, politically? And second, where do we stand in terms of the politics of coronavirus?
Well, I'll take the latter one first. I think the thing that's really striking about what's going on is just the unknowns. I think that's what's really driving everything at this point. I mean, you have what happened with the stock market the other day. It's up a little bit today, but it's still not in a great spot at this point. You have the situation on Capitol Hill. They're working through a package. They'll likely have a deal, but that still remains up in the air. And then you have everything else going on with the medical stuff. We have testing. There's still shortages in that people are questioning. There's a lot of questions about the administration's response to this, and we're going to have to see where this goes from here on.
Eleanor.
Oh, the speech was meant to be reassuring to Wall Street because this president seems to think he can solve a health crisis if he solves the economic jitters on Wall Street. It didn't work. The markets tumbled. He said there was a ban on travel from Europe, which is like ending the flights after people have already gotten here. And then he excludes the United Kingdom, where his buddy is the prime minister, which adds to this us versus them thing. And then he sticks another barb in there for the European Union, says no cargo can come in, which he just ad-libbed at the moment. And his people had to clean up after that, say that's not true. He didn't consult the allies. It was not an exercise in competent presidential leadership. And the Congress is now reacting, and that's being driven by Speaker Pelosi and the Treasury Secretary, Mr. Mnuchin. I mean, he's not an ideologue, and they're putting together a package that addresses the gaps in coverage caused by the economic fallout of the virus. And they're excluding the president's call for a payroll tax holiday, which would add 40% of the deficit and not address the problems that we're facing. So I think the president has really sidelined himself in this crisis, okay. and I'm glad that he has, frankly.
Carrie.
Well, I think that a lot of Trump supporters would strongly disagree and say that the president, in his press conference and before and after, has shown tremendous courage and resilience and provided the type of assurance that Americans need to feel that this will soon pass. And if you look at his decisive leadership as it relates to everything from, it was interesting on our website, justthenews.com, I did a piece looking at how the Trump campaign, it was sort of a throwback to the 1988 collapse of Joe Biden's campaign when he was accused of plagiarism. It was a tongue-in-cheek accusation of plagiarism of Joe Biden's response to the coronavirus, his videotape remarks. And pretty much line by line, if you go through the speech that Biden said, it was things that President Trump is already doing and has already been calling for, including, for example, free testing kits by health insurance executives. Making sure that people are responsible in isolating themselves and avoiding, as they say, these social interactions. He's already been saying this for quite a while. And then as far as the travel ban, the president has been, it wasn't just with Europe, it was China as well. And health experts are saying because of his decisive leadership with China, we've seen a relative much better containment here in the U.S. versus Italy or China or South Korea or Japan.
All right, Clarence.
Well, I hope he will support the funding of those new much needed features like the testing around the country. Without that, everything has been hampered. Now, we're not even don't really have a good idea how many people are infected. And there's going to be, you got more out of that speech than I did, I'll put it that way, because
Yes.
I heard a lot of contradictory remarks that really plunge the confidence that people are looking for in a president during a crisis like this. And we certainly saw that with the Wall Street reaction and the polarized polling results, which are sadly much like we've been seeing in the last few years, with Republicans saying, what a great job he's doing, and Democrats saying, I'm worried. So hopefully we're going to see a change in
there's
that.
a dear leader aspect to this. Everybody has to praise Trump for his courage before they go on and actually acknowledge all of the faults that have so far occurred. In terms of the testing, they test 10,000 people a day in South Korea. We've tested 11,000 total. So they really don't know how many people have this virus. I mean, what we're doing now with all the self-isolation in Washington, D.C., where we're sitting, is virtually shut down in the hope that they can sort of flatten out the curve of not everybody getting sick at the same time, so that we can get ahead of this and we don't turn into Italy, where the health systems are completely overwhelmed.
As far as this dear leader notion, I think that the national media, when you look at study after study, whether it's Harvard or elsewhere, showing the vast negative coverage of this president, to have people who are providing an alternative voice.
None of that is deserved, of course.
As far as the American people and the confidence that this president has, the levels are similar to Barack Obama's confidence levels and approval rating. So I just think that
50% in approval ratings. Trump never has to his
All right, let Carrie finish.
As far as his point in this presidency versus Obama's, they are comparable. And in terms of the ability for people to put aside partisanship and come together on the tax issue, I think that there is a strong argument that there needs to be some sort of fiscal relief. And in fact, Joe Biden called for relief for small businesses, which, guess what? President Trump has already been pushing forward for that. And when you look at the actual deaths, percentage-wise, and infections in the United States for this strain versus the typical flu, and we know the fatality rate is higher. However, on an actual aggregate level, we're only seeing about 3 dozen deaths so far.
I'm sorry. I listened to Tony Fauci from the National Institutes of Health. He's been at this during the AIDS crisis in the 80s. He was a voice of reason. Everything you have said is directly contradictory to what he has said. And he is becoming the face of this crisis, and he does inspire confidence. And we do need confidence in our leadership.
Let's bring Alan.
In favor of President Trump, and said that President Trump is following his leadership and following his direction. So we're in agreement on that.
Al?
I think what Fauci, it was important, he came out today, he was talking about how I think the timeline of this remains in flux. And he said it could be a couple of weeks. And we have a lot of these sporting events, a lot of these mass gatherings that are supposed to be banned for the next month, 3 weeks, give or take. But he's saying this could last up to 8 weeks. And we really don't know what's going to happen here. I mean, Fauci's really making an important point there. And we mentioned South Korea. We look at Italy. The rise there has been exponentially. But China right now, it's been going down. We have the warm weather. We'll have to wait and see what happens. It's a lot of unnowns at this point.
We'll know how this comes out. We'll know how this comes out.
All right, concluding comment.
Well, just one question. Why are Republicans only concerned about deficits when Democrats are in the White House? I mean, I saw Donald Trump throwing money at this problem, which I'm not opposed to. This problem needs some more money, but he does it quite casually, remarkably, and maybe we'll hear about deficits.
All right, you can have the
someday.
concluding comment
I think
then.
this is certainly an example of the need for a social safety net, which is exactly what conservatives have argued for decades, that there is a need for a social safety net.
Issue 2, MBS versus VVP.
Oil prices plummeted this week when Saudi Arabia sparked a price war with Russia. The two major oil exporters disagree over how much to cut output production in face of a global oil glut. The showdown pits Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman against Russian President Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. But while drivers will benefit from lower prices at the pump, analysts fear damage to U.S. shale-based energy producers. After all, those producers have far higher break-even points than current oil prices allow for.
Eleanor, is this oil price decline good for Americans?
In 1973 and 74, when OPEC pulled their tricks with the oil supply, prices quadrupled four times. and that was bad for American consumers. So this should be good for American consumers, but this is a much larger issue. This is Putin trying to absolutely get control of the oil market and to reduce the Saudis to bit players. And this is coming at a time when Putin is ensuring his continued presidency for life. He's got legislation through the Duma, the lower house. It now just has to be okayed by the Constitutional Court, which means he wouldn't leave office in 2024 and gives himself another 12 years. That's what this is about. I think the back and forth about oil and our shale market, that's the backstory.
That's a sideshow.
Yeah.
Al.
I think it's really a high-powered food fight, but I think the one thing that's worth watching is in the domestic side. We talk about shale, the president on the economy, where he's really tried to prop up Marcellus Shale at this point and the shale companies. You look ahead of November, Pennsylvania. That's some big-time Marcellus Shale country. They're pushing these low-interest government bonds or loans at this point to try to prop up the industry. Whether the president can do that will have to remains to be seen. I mean, a lot of these companies are already deeply in the red. It's going to be interesting to watch.
Okay, Carrie?
Well, I think that Putin is desperate. What he's trying to do is a game of chicken with the United States and our domestic producers. I agree, Al, as far as the politics of this. There are hundreds of thousands of American jobs that would be at stake if the shale revolution is stifled in this case, or suffers a blow due to the drop. I do think that the infrastructure and the civic society that we have with property rights, et cetera, in the United States puts American shale in a better position relative to the Saudis and to the Russians, but of course only time will tell.
Clarence?
Yeah, I agree. Isn't that wonderful? I think as far as, this is not good news for workers in the industry, because when oil prices go down, so does revenue, and so does so do investments, and et cetera. But also, when oil prices go down, gas guzzlers go up. And at a time when some of us are worried about climate change, et cetera, there's it's not good for the environment necessarily to have lower oil prices.
Well, fracking has been an issue in the Democratic primary, and I think Bernie Sanders is pretty adamant about stopping it, and I think Joe Biden, the likely nominee, he's given himself some outs. I think
a lot of wiggle room right there.
That's right. That's right. Which is, I think, the smart thing to do.
Eleanor, how do you see Joe Biden's response to, primarily the coronavirus issue this week?
I feel like this is a moment made for Joe Biden, and I didn't want to say that originally because I'd be accused of politicizing, but I think he brings a steady voice. I think people understand he was tested in the White House for 8 years. He was there during the Ebola outbreak in 2014 and 2015, and I think he's handling this responsibly. He has set up a Corona task force. It is like we have a parallel president here in the making, and I think the public's going to welcome that.
What's striking to me is you have a lot of conservatives going after Biden, going after him, saying he's politicizing the coronavirus issue. But on the other hand of this, what else are people going to talk about at this point? I mean, that's the topic du jour, no matter what the industry is at this point. Right. I mean, you can't avoid it, no matter where you go. You can't go out and talk about any sort of issue other than coronavirus. That is the issue, and you have to talk about it.
Anyone would consider politicizing the coronavirus issue. It already is. I mean, when you just tune into commentators on the right or the left, there's different levels of concern over how much danger is out there.
Right, and
one of the lightning rods in this debate will be the issue of China going forward. So this week we saw Senator Tom Cotton issued basically a stinging rebuke of Biden and said what this whole situation is showing is just how weak that Biden would be on China. And there have been so many disruptions to the supply chain because of our reliance and our lack of diversification in our supply chain. And this is only the tip of the iceberg unless our country learns to rely less on China. And President Trump, as his supporters would say, has been visionary in pushing back on this. And so Biden has been incredibly weak. And look, I'm just going to quote Barack Obama's own Defense Secretary, Robert Gates, who said that Joe Biden has been wrong on every foreign policy issue in the last 40 years.
Blaming the foreign virus on China is a favorite of the president's, and it was a smart move that he did ban travel from China. He was a little late off the mark with just about everything else.
So was China.
And so was China, but they now have it under control. But Ron Klain, who was the Ebola czar in the Obama White House, is one of Biden's top advisors. And these are people who've been through this, who understand how this works, and aren't about fixing blame. They're about fixing the problem and not understanding where it fits into their worldview, so that their supporters can't think that they have missed the boat on anything. So
it certainly does fit into solving the problem, though, because the problem, as U.S. authorities, nonpartisan authorities, have shown, the Chinese data and modeling as it relates to how the disease is spreading, the actual modeling of the virus itself, the data coming out of China is so unreliable, it's been basically useless in many cases.
The China part is over. The China part is over.
No, but it's
Well, China says it's over.
It's
the part
of the
as it
breakdown.
affects us is over. We have the virus here. Right. What are we going to do about it here and now,
Let's bring it out.
aside from blaming?
I think what's going to be worth watching is Sunday night is the next Democratic debate. It might be the last one for all we know. We have 4 more states coming up on Tuesday, which is almost seems like a formality at this point. But how the 2 candidates go out and respond to this virus is going to be important, and there's going to be millions of people watching. There's no sports on. There's nothing else for anybody else to watch, as we mentioned earlier. That's going to be it's going to be taking center stage.
Al, you're a political reporter. Do you see Bernie Sanders as having a chance of securing the nomination now?
Not really. No.
Not really?
Not
you
really.
Want to expound on that?
No, I mean, the issue right now is he doesn't have much of he doesn't have any oxygen to operate at this point. The coronavirus has taken everything that he could have used. I mean, his main way of messaging had been big events, railing against corporate everything, billionaires, everything. And he doesn't have that ability right now. He's kind of trying to message that under the.
And Biden is 150 delegates ahead, and because the Democrats award delegates proportionately, it's very difficult for Sanders to catch up, especially when the states ahead are ones that he lost in 2016.
I mean, you look at,
but he will use the spotlight, and he will use the spotlight to argue that if we had Medicare for all, we wouldn't have to worry about undocumented immigrants being afraid to report illnesses, and that every American should have the right to health care.
I mean, you look at Tuesday, there's 4 states. It's Illinois, Ohio, Arizona, and Florida. And 3 of those states are definitely going Biden's way.
We will move on. Issue 3, rockets in Iraq.
Let's just put it this way, you will see.
That was how President Trump responded to a rocket attack on an American military base in Iraq. Conducted by Iranian proxies, the attack killed 2 Americans and 1 British service member. In response, the U.S. military struck Iranian proxy targets in eastern Syria, killing at least 25 fighters. The violence reflects Iran's growing escalation against U.S. interests in Iraq and beyond. Note, for example, that analysts believe Iran has rapidly increased its enriched uranium stock in recent weeks, raising renewed fears it may develop a nuclear weapon.
Carrie, are we heading for escalation with Iran in terms of both these rocket incidents and the retaliation that we've seen, but also in the nuclear issue?
Well, I think that what the president did with pulling the United States out of the Iranian nuclear deal was exactly what needed to happen as it relates to having increasing leverage against Iran, because the deal that was passed had a sunset provision. And so the Iranians were going to obtain the weapon and while enriching themselves in the process monetarily in addition to uranium. But as it relates to what's happening in Iraq, I think that so far the response has been contained. It has been in a direct response to the U.S. and British servicemen that were killed. And I will note, as my colleague at Just the News reported, this attack happened on Soleimani's birthday. I do not think that was a coincidence as a retaliation for the killing of that general. So I think what's happened so far has been responsible. It's been contained. And also, the Iranians are seeing chaos as it relates to the coronavirus. This could be an opening for the forces within Iran who are interested in freedom and possibly toppling the regime.
So another courageous action by our dear leader, pulling out of that treaty. I wish Pat were here, and maybe you feel the same way. Pat felt that the Iran nuclear ambitions were contained. That was a 15-year sunset provision. It wasn't today or tomorrow. So I think that Iran and Iraq are looking at this country and they see us shutting down under the weight of the coronavirus, and there's lots of room for mischief making. There's also room for mischief making coming out of the Oval Office. So I would keep an eye on what the administration plans to do. I think the response so far has been appropriate and proportionate.
I think it's very interesting though that with this virus that this has kind of been not exactly the big news of the day. Normally this would be
Right.
really big news. Right now with the coronavirus, this is kind of, flying under the radar. I mean, I think that's really the important thing is this coronavirus has really just consumed everything, including foreign affairs. I mean, we just had the Soleimani strike a couple months ago.
Right.
I mean, this
Iran story would be big news
would be
if not
very
for
big
coronavirus.
news.
But at
Yeah.
least we're covering it. All right, Clarence.
Yeah, well, I think Iran wants to show they're still in the game, but at the same time, do it at a time in which our attention is elsewhere. But I don't think they want to have an all-out war with the U.S., and we don't want a war with them. But with the nuclear deal now sidelined, we have more of a problem with what Iran may do as they try to empower themselves with nuclear. And we lost what leverage we had.
And with Netanyahu, who's always been the big pusher for aggression against Iran, he's somewhat preoccupied, I guess, going into maybe a fourth election. He hasn't been able to put together a government. So I think that, I don't imagine him and President Trump, trying to ramp up military activities.
Carrie, how do you see the Trump administration's strategy with Iran? It seems slightly ad hoc at the moment.
I think it's been consistent in terms of being consistently pro-freedom, consistently seeking for America's interests, consistently seeking for more transparency. Because yes, the deal had a 15-year sunset, but there's certainly strong evidence to suggest that the Iranians were not fulfilling everything and not allowing the inspectors that were necessary in to verify on every single level in every single stipulation under the deal. So in many respects, the deal, arguably, the administration would
Actually,
say
that's
was
not correct. I think Trump's own administration said that they were fulfilling the deal,
Certain
as
portions of it.
as
come back
did
to
the
you, yeah.
Europeans. So,
Yeah, but to Carrie's point, I mean, the Mossad, right, have found on a couple of occasions Iran was deceiving the IAEA in terms of hiding materials that related to nuclear weapons. I mean, that's a concern, right?
The deal put a lid on that. They are now trying to fight back the only way they know how, and that's to kind of scare us that they're going to go nuclear. I don't think that's what they would like to do. And I think this president has basically, with the maximum pressure campaign, has basically squeezed them to the part where their economy is really suffering. And they've got the coronavirus, and the president did say that he would be willing to help or offer to help. I don't know, maybe there's a bridge there on a simple human-to-human basis that we're all in this together globally.
Do you think that if Joe Biden wins, the Senate will be able to pass a return to
Yes.
the JCPOA? You do?
Yes.
Okay. Al?
Potentially. A lot of balls are up in the air there.
Carrie?
They'd have to completely restructure their entire government the way the Iranian Revolutionary Guard conducts terrorism around the world. And also, not to mention, it was not shocking, but it was disappointing when the Obama administration admitted when they were signing into this Iranian deal that the money that would flow from this deal would then be used in Yemen, in Lebanon, and throughout the Middle East through proxy terrorists that are being funded essentially from American markets, European markets, because of this deal.
Do you think the president has a vulnerability on foreign policy, though, that if something sparks off big with Iran, that could be a challenge for him going into November, no?
I think that so far, the administration's responses, if you talk to his supporters, they support that they have been relatively contained. And I agree with Eleanor that it has been proportionate and responsible. I do certainly hope that they will maintain that course.
What a nice note to end on. That you two agree. All right.
Pieces at hand.
Let's move on to predictions.
Yeah.
Prediction, it's a grim one. I believe the Democratic National Convention will get canceled this year.
Wow.
I
You have a reason?
I think this coronavirus thing is serious. I think I think baseball's going to get pushed longer than everyone expects. I think the DNC is going to have to be affected too.
Not the RNC, though?
The RNC's in August. We'll have to wait and see on that.
All
A little
right,
bit further
Ellen.
off.
Well, I was going to look ahead to the Sunday debate between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, and I'm going to point out that this is not 2016. The stakes are so much higher, and that there's a lot of pressure on Sanders to handle the winding down of the primaries responsibly, but there's also pressure on Biden to leave the door open and to be welcoming to Sanders supporters. So I think the Sunday debate will be an interesting dynamic between two men who've known each other for 30 years. There'll be a lot of my good friend this and good friend that, because it will be like they're on the Senate floor.
Okay, Carrie.
I predict, and thank you for the Italian lesson for us all about the quaranta, the 40 days or so. I do believe that in the next month and a half or so, that the country will be largely returned back to normal, that this virus will be contained and we'll be able to mitigate and minimize the deaths.
Okay, optimistic.
I'm not going to make a guess on a virus's future, but I'm going to be even more daring and imagine the future of young voters. I think the big question is going to be after this coming week's primary in Illinois and other states is what happened to Bernie's youth vote that he was going to bring out in great numbers. I think it's a very important long-term question as well as short-term.
That is a very good point. In lieu of prediction, I want to give a shout out to our foreign viewers, Mark Bernstein in particular. Thank you for watching, Mark, and thank you to all of our foreign viewers for watching. Okay, be sure to check out our podcast wherever you get your audio, and we will see you next time. Thank you.